Hi. The lesson I'm sharing with you today is the lesson of Abraham, and it really goes in close companionship with the story of Sarah for obvious reasons. So you'll be teaching the story of Abraham while the other class is having Sarah, and then you'll flip-flop next week. So it would be helpful to watch the video in which I share the lesson of Sarah, just so that you can kind of complement them, and you'll be able to answer questions and draw connections between the two, even if you don't teach both lessons. So as we get started today, you'll keep in mind that we're still in the midst of the summer season just for the next 2 weeks. So you'll change the circle of the church here to reflect the next day, and that'll be another day in the great green growing season. I wouldn't really begin the lesson until you feel that everyone's joined you. They'll all be going into worship, and so it takes a moment for them to kind of get the cue to come in from the music portion of the liturgy. So as they come in, you'll get them settled. I definitely recommend reviewing some of the expectations of the classroom. Just since it's such a short period of time, it's better to expedite behavior issues so that you don't have to keep stopping in the midst of the lesson. So remind the children that there's a time to listen and there's a time to talk, and this will be your opportunity to talk and their opportunity to listen, and then later they'll have the chance to share, and so you can kind of nip conversations in the bud and remind them, we can talk about that at feast time, we can talk about that during worship, but the lesson itself needs to take precedent because it's such a short little window that you have after music and before they go home. So as you begin the lesson, take a moment to remind the children that you've been talking through stories in the Old Testament from the very beginning. In the last month or so, we've had creation and the fall and Noah, and we've really just been kind of stepping through just into the beginning of the Old Testament. And last week we talked about the parable of the Good Shepherd, so you might want to draw connections again to those beginning years, the things that we read in the Bible as precursors to Jesus' birth, because we're building toward that Advent season. And the Good Shepherd was a psalm that was shared by David and then again brought back to the forefront by Jesus himself. So something to kind of draw a connection between the Old and the New Testament as we vary into all these Old Testament characters and the people that preceded and moved forward the story of Jesus' rescue plan. So with all that to say, after you've gotten all the kids gathered up together and you begin your lesson, do bear in mind and keep an eye on the clock, since they will have their worship time and their feast kind of combined just for the sake of time. So you can talk about feast, do your candle time, but then maybe deliver the feast to them while they're painting, or have them, while they're interacting with the story, sit down and have their food before they head home, because otherwise you really won't have enough time. Okay, sorry for all the caveats. As we begin the lesson today, I'm going to kind of spread out the whole story of Abraham's life, and I'll be pausing throughout, but we won't have a lot of wondering time because it's really meant to be a little bit more of a factual, content-based lesson, and so I won't pause as much for input. So, okay, thanks, and we'll begin. The lesson that I'm sharing with you today is an important one, so we all need to get ready. It's an important lesson because it's a lesson that tells us the beginning of the story, the long story in which we get ready for Jesus. Remember last week when we talked about, or a few weeks ago when we talked about Noah, that new beginning that God promised, the way that God promised and agreed that he would bring salvation the next time, the way that he would send his son to rescue us. Well, before Jesus came, God's people did a lot of wandering. There was a lot of confusion about how to best love God and best love each other. And today I'm going to tell you a story of someone that lived a long, long, long time ago. God's story thus far has included many heroic and amazing and surprising actions by the people of God. The people of God have worked hard. They're trying to do what's right, and they often make mistakes. But they often do things that are really wonderful. Now, Abraham was the father of a great family. Abraham was someone who traveled far and wide with his wife, Sarah. They were pretty old by the time they began their traveling. They were part of this great family of God, of all the people that loved and worshiped God. And he and Sarah traveled from the home that was familiar to them, from the people and the places that they knew. They went from Ur to Haran, and then on into a brand new land that they didn't know anything about. But as they traveled, God was with them, and they placed altars in each place that they traveled. They lived in Shechem, they lived in Bethel, and they lived in Hebron. God was there. God was there. And always God was there. No matter where they traveled, no matter where they went, God was there. When they came into the new land, Abraham went up on a hill in Shechem to pray, and God was there. Of course, he prayed to God in Bethel too. God was there. When they pitched their tents in Hebron and stopped, God was there too. Remember that Abraham and Sarah did not live in a house like you live in, or an apartment or a condo like you have your bed in. They lived in a tent. So they pitched their tent in Hebron. God was there. As you may know, God had promised Abraham some pretty important things. He had promised Abraham and Sarah that they would be the mother and father of a great family, a big family that spread far and wide. He had promised them that their family would be as many as there are grains of sand in the desert. Look at all that sand. That's only a little bit of sand. Imagine all the grains of sand in the whole desert or along every ocean shore. He had promised them that they would have as many children as there are stars in the sky. Now, that's just a few stars to help tell the story. But imagine all the stars you see up in the sky. God had even promised them that they would have such a big family, so many children, it was like all the dust in the land. That's a lot of dust right there. Imagine all the dust in all the land. God promised them they would have such a great and numerous family. But still, they had no children. So how could this be true, they wondered. How would they have a huge, humongous family if they didn't even have one child? Well, they trusted God, even though they weren't sure how it could happen. One day, 3 strangers arrived. They came out of the desert. Abraham and Sarah were not expecting them. But they told them, guess what? You will have a child. You will have a child at last. No, Abraham and Sarah just laughed and laughed because they were so surprised. But it was true. Abraham and Sarah did have a baby. And because when the strangers had told them what would happen, they just laughed and laughed and laughed, they decided to name their son Isaac, because Isaac means laughter. Well, their son Isaac grew and grew and grew, just as you do. Taller, stronger, smarter, with more questions. He grew up. He was a big boy. He wasn't quite a man. But during this time, God appeared to Abraham and said, "Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, whom you adore, and take him to the land of Moriah. Offer him as a burnt offering upon the mountain." A long time ago, the people would kill and burn an animal to show God that they cared and to show God that they had given something up, sacrificed for God. So God has asked Abraham to give up, to sacrifice his one child, his one son. Abraham was really surprised because he loved his son and didn't want to hurt him. But he trusted God, and he wanted to follow along with what God said. So with a deep sigh, the next day, he cut the wood that he would need to burn the fire. He cut the wood. He took a donkey and 2 helpers, and he said, "Isaac, it's time for us to go." And they began to walk to the mountain. After 3 days of traveling, they could see the mountain. Abraham knew what needed to happen. He knew he needed to follow with what God said and be obedient no matter what. He loved God first. After 3 days, they saw the mountain. They built the fire. Abraham got what he needed. Abraham told his helpers to stay over there with the donkey. And he and Isaac alone went up the mountain.